Hey there, YouTube. This is Jonathan, and we're going to get started with the second installment of my tour through Zurich 1953 by Bronstein, um, or Bronstein, rather. This time we got a matchup between Mark Taimanov and David Bronstein himself. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we get a D4 opening, which gets into a Benoni system. And David refers to this as a Benoni in the book, but it really seems like it's a Benko Gambit at this point, or at least that it's transposed into one. I'm guessing that maybe the Benko just wasn't popularized yet, or wasn't known by that name at this time, but the ideas are all the same. Black is going to give up a pawn. In return, he's going to get play down the A and the B file, and along with this dark squared bishop that's going to really put a lot of pressure on, especially on B2. Um, Pretty familiar type of plan. We see this quite a bit now. So bishop g7, knight f3, pretty simple standard development here, and it makes it a true pawn sacrifice. So there's no way that black is going to be able to retrieve the pawn here. And I think it's instructive that he takes with the bishop also. Black would like to trade with these bishops, but most importantly, he doesn't take with the knight. And the reason why he doesn't take with the knight is that he wants to play knight d7 to b6 to a4 so that he can later trade this knight. Because the knight on c3 is an important defender of both a2 and really b2 because it blocks the bishop's influence. So it's important in the system that you take with the bishop, and then if they trade bishops, you again take with the rook, which is what we'll see happen here. So he just castles, develops his queen, rook e1. So, and then we get this trade, and begins with rook a6, and then queen e2. Which this is the first move that Bronstein really begins to criticize Mark Taimanov's play. He suggested that what he should do in this position is play bishop to f4 and queen to d2, and then follow that up by putting his rooks on the the c1 and the b1 squares, and to begin preparing b4. He says that playing in that way, white begins to actually try to realize their extra pawn, and they've removed all of their pieces from the from this dark diagonal that is going to cause problems later in this game. Instead, by playing queen e2, Bronstein is suggesting that he's trying to play e5, but he says that tactically this isn't going to work, and we'll look at some examples of why not here in a second. So rook af8, just continuing to put pressure on here, and h3, which is where Taimanov has changed his mind and decided that e5 is not going to work. So if he plays e5 immediately instead, then we get this variation, where we get a bunch of trades, and after the rook takes here, black or white really has no initiative against the e pawn like he wants. Just after a simple king f8, and this knight is going to have trouble going anywhere because it's needed to defend this pawn. The bishop can't develop. So I mean, something like if the bishop just comes out to try to grab the isolated pawn there, we just get something simple like this, and already there's problems with it, and black is going to quickly regain his pawn and keep an initiative. There's really no good place to develop the bishop. Even out here, we could just play h6. Of course, he doesn't want to trade bishop for knight here. That can't possibly work. And you have the same problem if he goes to e3. If he goes to f4, then the knight can jump out, and he's going to end up dropping that bishop or exchanging it for the knight, which is going to leave the dark square bishop unopposed. So he can't go for that. So instead, he played h3, which is just kind of a waiting move. It's going to keep the knight out of g4. Sometimes we'll go knight g4 and then knight e5, so it prevents that. So we got knight b6, which is so black's just going to continue on with that plan of exchanging the knights there. Bishop g5, knight e8. He doesn't. This is excuse me. This is covering, allowing the queen to cover e8 in case now we get e5 is not going to come with tempo either. And so Taimanov, realizing that e5 isn't going to work, he retreats his bishop back, but he didn't need to do that. Better was probably just to play a3, which gives Black the opportunity to win his pawn back, but it's going to cost him his dark squared bishop. And so after a variation like this, the material is back to equal, but really Black has got no more initiative, there's no more targets, and White can begin to focus on his own initiative. So I mentioned back in this position that e5 wouldn't work. It actually does drop a piece here, or at least a pawn. So after e5, the pawn takes, we get knight takes, bishop takes, queen, bishop, and the problem is we have this fork on the end here. So after this, Black has too much material, and this isn't going to work out. So going back to bishop d2, Black again continuing on with his very straightforward plan. He's now realized the plan of exchanging these knights, and there's really not anything that White can do about that. So he acquiesces. We get this exchange, and then White tries to oppose the bishops, and it's important here that that Bronstein does not go ahead and win the pawn here. So if he goes ahead and tries to win this pawn, again he has no more targets on the king side. And White is just ready to fire off e5, and this time it's going to come with some real threats. He's got definitely an initiative in the center, and like I said, Black's rook on a2 is not doing anything. So Bronstein avoids this variation, and instead plays bishop takes c3. And then follows up with queen a5, and he has a clear idea here if he wants to try to head into an endgame. So queen d3 to defend the pawn, and then he offers a queen trade, which may seem surprising, but especially given that he's still down a pawn. But this is kind of a typical Benko endgame type position. Black is going to have an advantage because the pawn on c3 and e4 are both going to be weak, whereas his own pawn weakness on d7 is going to be pretty easy to defend. White can never really play e5 in this situation because then d5 is going to get weak. So let's look at some variations to show that. So if we trade the queens, go into a real endgame, and then if he tries to hold the pawn on a2, then just knight f6, and he's not gonna be able to hold both of these pawns anymore. So like knight d2, we're gonna take, and then he's got a pen problem, and maybe we're just gonna play rook c2 next and have trouble with that pawn. So this is clearly a better situation. Going back to queen takes, if instead he plays e5 here, we can see that just after a simple knight c7, the d5 pawn is virtually undefendable. And then, or if instead after the queen trade, it just like rook a b1, we can just get rook x a2, and then if he tries to head back, then we get this kind of a position. And again, white is not doing too well here, given the same weaknesses. So he avoids the queen trade, which is good. But then, so Black just picks up his pawn, and he goes for e5, which again is another move that Bronstein criticizes. He suggests that he should have again avoided a queen trade. So, because with the queens on the board, it's possible that his e5 break might actually yield him initiative. But instead, he plays e5 and allows Black to trade queens. So we trade queens, and and then it's similar to an earlier variation. Just brings the king over to guard the pawn, and White has a pretty simple drawing plan if he can make it happen. He'd like to trade knights, and then he can trade these two pawns for this one. And if he can do that, then it's the 4-on-3 rook ending should be a draw. But it's pretty difficult to pull this off. And then Taimanov doesn't help things out because he immediately makes a mistake. He very optimistically goes after the pawn, but Bronstein just advances, and we see why. And then the king just gets shoved back. So instead of attacking the pawn, Bronstein suggests that he should just play king f1. And now, if we go into a similar variation, the king is going to be able to come to the center instead of getting pushed back. So, but after knight b3, c4, and then now the king is jettisoned out of the center of the board entirely. So we get knight f6, just covering the d7 square. So we had some potential threats there, driving the king away and then dropping the e-pawn. And then he's also perhaps threatening to attack this c3 pawn, and also this knight might help attack some of the kingside pawns. So knight e4, and black does not allow an exchange of knights, as we discussed earlier. So rook g5 and rook a2, and this move is clever because the white knight is almost trapped. Like, for example, say we get king g1 trying to come back out. Then we can play rook e2, and the knight has very few squares. And then, excuse me, after knight g3, he can go check, king back, and then f5. And white is in a situation where he is going to have to give up the knight because there's no way to stop f4. If instead of knight g3, going back a little bit, if he played f3, then just immediately f5 is going to cause problems. If he goes to g3, then we get rook c2. And there's just no way for him to hold on to the c-pawn now. And again, he's probably going to, excuse me, he's probably going to end up losing the knight or worse going into this. So just going back to the position after rook g4, black plays f5, and then this rook maneuver allows him to hold on to the knight because of this pin against the king. So then black is just going to continue on going after these pawns, which are no longer defensible. So he wins the first pawn, and it looks like he's shortly going to try to win a second pawn. There's not white can't really take on c4 because it will cost him his f-pawn, and he also can't take on h7. So, for example, rook takes c4, he loses the f-pawn, takes on h7, just drive them back, and then this nice trick here on g2. So he just takes it and he gets a fork, and now he's going to pick back up the rook that he had dropped, and he'll have a pawn up, knight in game, which should be pretty comfortably won for him. So going back to rook d4, he plays knight b6, which defends the pawn, and we get a check, and the king comes out, f4, just h6 kicking the knight, and then after it's re-centralized, then the knight comes back in after c3, again trying to threaten his pawn, but he's going to run into the same problems we looked at in the earlier variation. He takes the pawn, but he can't really do that. As a side note, if the knights were off the board here, this would actually be the drawn position that Bronstein suggested that Taimanov should hope for. But there are knights on the board, and so we go knight d5, which is threatening the f4 pawn, but it has another threat as well, a threat on the g2 pawn, which Taimanov doesn't catch or doesn't realize that he can do anything about. So he just plays knight f3 so that the rook can defend, and we get the same sacrifice as earlier. Only this time it's even worse because he's down 2 pawns instead of 1. So king h1, coming back, and he's going to drop a third pawn, and so Taimanov just resigns here. So this is a pretty nice advert for the Benoni Benko systems for those who play them. So I think it's a really instructive example for how black should play and going into that typical endgame. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this, and we'll continue to look at these games in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.